Let's talk about the dangers of psychedelics. As you probably already know, I'm a huge advocate for psychedelics, using them for personal development and for spiritual development to raise your consciousness. And I've been very positive in the past. I've released trip report videos, and I've discussed various benefits and insights that I've received from psychedelics. And I've also talked about some of the dangers in the past, but I wanted to record an episode specifically addressing all the dangers because sometimes I get the sense that people misunderstand me. And I do very much care about how psychedelics are misused and abused by people. And there are a lot of immature people who go into psychedelics who don't do their research and don't think through some of the stuff that could potentially occur when you're using psychedelics. So for that reason, and precisely because I'm such a huge advocate of them and I tend to speak so positively about them, I wanted to do one episode that just focuses exclusively on the negatives and the dangers. So this is going to be a lopsided episode. And if all you hear about psychedelics is this episode, you're going to get a skewed perspective because I'm not going to be talking about any of the good stuff, none of the benefits, just the bad stuff here, all right? And various kinds of precautions that you should be taking. So this is to sober your mind. This is the information you need if you're going to be tripping seriously. And I have a lot of insight about the dangers and the risks for several reasons. First of all, because I've done a lot of psychedelics myself. I've done over 100 trips at various dosages from low to very high. And I've done everything, some of the most powerful psychedelics that there are. I've done mushrooms, LSD. I've done DPT, DMT, 5-MeO-DMT, 4-ACO-DMT, other research chemicals that most people don't even know about, new research chemicals that nobody knows about that I'll be introducing and sharing in the future, salvia. Like, I've done some crazy stuff. There's still some that I haven't done that I'll maybe do in the future. But anyways, so I'm coming from direct experience here. I have a lot of experience with this. I've had a few bad trips myself. I've studied this field a lot theoretically as well. I've read a lot of trip reports. I've interacted with a lot of people who have done psychedelics. I've watched people take psychedelics. I've seen the kinds of reactions that can happen. I've dealt with followers of mine who report having done psychedelics and then report various kinds of problems that arise for them. And so that's where I'm coming from. So here's a list. This is going to be a very comprehensive list, like of 20 or 30 things that are the top dangers. This is pretty much all the dangers that there are that I can think of at least. So first and foremost is overdosing. That's at the top of the list. Now with overdosing, there's really two issues here. There's a mild version of it and then the extreme version of it. The extreme version of it is literally you take so much that you kill yourself. That's pretty difficult to do with most psychedelics. Almost impossible with something like mushrooms or LSD. You need to take a ridiculously large amount. Although there are certain research chemicals and other psychedelics that you could take where you could kill yourself. Like with MDMA. The lethal dose for MDMA is actually not that high. So it's conceivable. So that is a serious danger. You want to understand what the dosages are and what the lethal dosages are and stay far away from those. So there's that. The more common, though, version of overdosing is simply taking a dose that's too high. And this, I think, is perhaps one of the single most common problems with psychedelics, is that you just take a dose that's too high. And the reason this happens is because people are sloppy. They're not carefully weighing their dosages with a milligram scale the way they should be. They're just popping stuff, hoping that they got the right dose. This is extremely reckless and will lead to dangerous situations. When your dose gets too high, you're unable to navigate. You might lose bodily function. You might pass out. You might lose consciousness. And then depending on where you are physically, that could potentially lead to a lethal situation or a very dangerous situation. You might physically harm yourself, fall over, crack your skull open, this sorts of stuff. Or you just might become seriously disoriented for a few hours, leading to all sorts of psychological problems, an existential crisis or something like that. And I think the reason this happens is that people are just too cocky and they overestimate how much they can handle and they underestimate how powerful psychedelics are. I guarantee you that there is not a dose of psychedelic at which you will be able to handle it. There's always going to be some dose at which you won't be able to handle it, and it will freak you out, and it will be a net negative for your development personally and spiritually. So the solution to this is very simple. Stay within the low to moderate dose range. There's no need to go into the crazy high doses. I think another big problem here is that people get kind of egotistical about this whole thing, and they want to outdo themselves by doing more and more and more, thinking that the more they do, the more they're going to deconstruct their ego, the closer they're going to reach to enlightenment, or, you know, they're going to have some sort of bragging rights on online forums like, oh, I did 500 or 1,000 micrograms of LSD. Look how great I am. And in practice, this is going to actually set you back, and you're going to regret it. And nothing is gained by this sort of game. That there's nobody that you need to one up with your dose, not anyone else, and certainly not even yourself. It's not about getting to high doses. It's about becoming more conscious, and you can actually become more conscious of stuff at moderate doses sometimes than at high doses, because at high doses it's just too crazy, and your mind is not able to integrate and make sense of it. What really matters is making sense of it and letting it transform your everyday life, not reaching some sort of crazy peak that is so crazy that you can't even hold it in your memory afterwards. So just keep it in the moderate to low dose range. Check your ego. The next danger is simply physical harm. All sorts of physical harm, of course, is possible, especially if you're taking high doses where you become disoriented, you lose control of your body, or simply you're using your body in a reckless manner. You might hit your arms, your legs, you might trip, you might fall over, depending on where you are. If you're especially in some sort of outdoors environment, in a crowded environment like a rave setting or a nightclub setting, these can be quite dangerous. If you're not careful at night, you're not looking where you're going. So you want to be doing these psychedelics generally in a indoor environment where it's safe. There's no balconies, no ledges, no sharp corners where you can crack your skull open, this sort of stuff. And another way to prevent this kind of physical harm is simply to actually discipline yourself to sit still when you're tripping. I've read a lot of trip reports where people are running around, jumping around, flailing their arms, running naked through the streets outside. This is where you will physically harm yourself. So just discipline yourself to sit still. Sit still and contemplate. And then you're going to avoid the physical harm. Don't be doing psychedelics on rooftops, on balconies with high ledges, places where you can trip over, fall down. Common sense stuff. Another related danger with the physical harm is vomiting. So people commonly vomit on psychedelics, although I've done 100 trips plus and I've never vomited once. So it really is a matter of being careful with your protocol. You don't have to be vomiting. But a lot of people do because they're not careful. They do psychedelics after eating, which is mostly why you vomit. And then if you're going to be taking a high dose, you might pass out. If you're vomiting and passing out at the same time, this potentially creates a lethal situation. So again, be careful. A very easy way to avoid vomiting on psychedelics is simply to follow the following rule, which is don't take psychedelics within 4 hours of eating anything. That's my rule. That's the rule that I follow. That means that I will not take a psychedelic unless I haven't eaten for 4 hours. This ensures I have an empty stomach and then there's nothing to vomit. Even if you feel like vomiting, you're not going to have anything to vomit at that point. So it's very easy to avoid vomiting. The next danger is bad trips, the classic bad trip. Now, there's different degrees of bad trips. There's bad trips and there's really, really, really bad trips. Those are the ones you especially want to avoid. Most people have no idea how bad of a bad trip can get. because people totally underestimate the power of consciousness. See, consciousness is all powerful and it's infinite. Consciousness is rendering your entire sense of reality and everything you've ever seen or known. And consciousness can literally imagine, conjure up, and manifest anything that you can possibly imagine, and even things you can't imagine. The worst nightmares can come to life on psychedelics. Think of the worst nightmare you've ever had in your life, and then imagine it being manifest as real or even more real than this physical reality that you're in right now. And imagine that lasting for 2, 3, 5 hours. And in fact, it's even worse than that, because when you're in these psychedelic peaks, there's no notion of time. So some of these horrific trips can seem like they last for eternity, literally eternity. So imagine being stuck in the worst possible hellish nightmare you can imagine, where you're being tortured and devils are coming at you and all sorts of crazy things. You're in total madness, and it seems like you're stuck there for eternity, and it seems like you'll never return. That's another aspect of these bad trips, is that it's not like you're having a bad trip and then you can just kind of convince yourself that, oh, well, okay, everything's going to be fine. I'll be back to normal in a few hours. Sometimes you can reassure yourself that way, but if you're in a really, really bad trip, that there won't be that reassurance, because you're going to actually believe that you are fully in that new reality. You're going to completely lose memory of even having an old reality to come back to, or an old life. You're going to forget all about material existence. You're going to be in that new reality. It's going to be a hellish reality. You're going to have no control over it. Your ego is not going to be able to manipulate it. You're going to be stuck in thought loops that you won't be able to control, and it's just going to be this downward, infinite spiral into hell. That is possible. Beware of that. And the way you avoid that is lower your doses. Those kind of super bad trips usually happen when you dose too high. And also, you need to ground yourself and be sort of psychologically healthy so that you don't have a paranoid mind. The more paranoid your mind is, the more likely you are to go into these negative thought spirals and then lose control and go into these states of madness. So that's certainly possible. Be careful with that, especially if you have a mind that tends to be depressive and negative, and you're not able to control your thoughts very well. You're not able to cut off negative thoughts, and you tend to dwell on those. Be careful, because that will get you into bad trip territory. Then your doses need to be very low. The next danger with psychedelics is simply facing fear and trauma. Most people who get involved with psychedelics are fairly immature and also tend to have quite a bit of trauma in their life from their childhood and adolescence. And they also tend to be fairly fearful. And so what psychedelics, of course, will do is they will deconstruct your mind and your reality. They will screw with your sense of what you think is real and unreal. They will get you to confront traumas, shadow sides of yourself, the sides and aspects of your psyche that you've been repressing and hiding. And so if you have a lot of that shadow material, if you have a lot of trauma you've been repressing, it's going to come out. Psychedelics will force that to come out. Now, that's not a bad thing. That's actually a good thing. The psychedelic is doing this because this is actually necessary for your personal and spiritual growth. But that doesn't mean it's going to feel good. And it also doesn't mean that your ego is going to be prepared to handle it. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. Really, it depends on how much is brought up, how quickly. This is why if you keep your doses low to moderate, you can gradually start facing some of your fears and traumas in a way that you can handle. But if you just jack up the dose without gradually ramping yourself up, it's going to be more than you can handle. And this is going to set you back. This is one of the counterintuitive aspects of doing this psychedelic work, is that you think that, like, well, I'm going to push my dose higher and higher and higher because, the more I can do, the better, right? Well, not necessarily. Think about it like going to the gym. If you just go to the gym and you haven't ever gone, and then on the first day you think you can bench press or squat 200, 300 pounds like you see other people doing because you think, oh, well, I should be as good as them. I don't want to look like a pussy or something. And so you try to squat or bench 200, 300 pounds on your first go. What are you going to do? You're going to hurt yourself. You're going to sprain a muscle. You're going to break something. And this is actually going to force you to stay out of the gym for the next few months. You might even damage your spine to such a degree that you'll have a spinal injury for the next 10 years of your life with chronic pain. And counterintuitively, this will actually slow your progress at the gym. So the proper approach at the gym is to go slow and steady and gradually build yourself up over a period of months and years to get to those very high weights. That's how people get there. Well, with psychedelics, it's the same thing. And one of the biggest problems I see is that people take one of those heroic doses because they want to prove their macho-ness or whatever. They're not able to handle it. They freak themselves out. Too much fear, too much trauma comes up. This scares them from ever doing psychedelics again, or it requires that they take a couple of years off just to reground themselves. And in so doing, they actually slow their progress. Psychedelics are just like the gym. It does very little good to go to the gym once and to lift a very heavy weight once. It doesn't really change you. It doesn't grow you. What works is to do a little bit consistently over months and years. That's what really benefits you. Same thing with psychedelics. But as you're doing that, you want to make sure that you don't freak yourself out so much that you get PTSD, anxiety, nightmares, depression, you fall into some sort of solipsism, or have some sort of profound spiritual or existential crisis that prevents you from doing the personal development work and the conscious work that you should be doing on a regular basis. The next danger with psychedelics is the potential for psychological instability, ungrounding of the mind, deconstruction of the mind, nihilism, a loss of sense of reality, a loss of your illusions, and depersonalization. All of these can happen. Some of these can be good, but again, it's really a matter of degree. If it happens to you a little bit each time, you can handle it. But if you get too much of it all at once, you're not going to be able to handle it, and your life can spiral out of control. You can literally have a psychotic break. You can have an existential crisis that will lead you to make rash decisions in your life that will harm you and that you will later regret. You can lose sense of what's real. You can feel like you're losing your mind. You can feel like you're going insane. You can end up in a mental institution. I know several people to whom that's happened, and you don't want that. You can go into this spiral of depression or nihilism where you feel like nothing matters anymore. Your life doesn't matter. You lose joy for life. You lose all sense of meaning. And then this can cascade throughout your entire life into your family, into your career and other things, and lead to a lot of destruction. So you do have to be very careful about that. We're trying to deconstruct the mind. In general, that's a good thing, but it does matter the rate at which you do it. You have to deconstruct your mind in a way where it doesn't become dysfunctional, where your mind doesn't spiral out of control into some sort of craziness. So watch out for that. Another danger is simply confusion. Psychedelics can make you very confused about reality and life and what's really going on. And this confusion can just be emotionally stressful and difficult to cope with. And it can last for months or years, depending on how much tripping you're doing and what kind of confusion you have. Now, in general, confusion is not a bad thing. Confusion, in fact, is a good thing. I have a whole episode called How to Deal with Confusion. So confusion's not bad per se, as long as it doesn't make you do stupid and rash things in your life. The next danger is mental illness. Some of you who are going to be doing these psychedelics have mental illnesses, bipolar disorder, schizophrenic tendencies, or depression, or PTSD, or anxiety, or whatever you got. You got to be careful with the mental illnesses because the psychedelics can exacerbate those. They can crank those up to 11. And then what's going to happen is that then you're going to end up probably at a mental institution where they're going to over-medicate you, and those medications are going to further throw off the balance of your body and your mind, and it's not going to lead to a good situation. Then you're going to get addicted to those medications. Then it's going to take you months and years to wean yourself off those medications. So if you have a mental illness, depending on what kind you have, of course, there's a lot of variety there, lots of difference in degrees. If you have a mild one, you can still take psychedelics. And in fact, psychedelics can actually help with mental illness. But you have to be extra, extra careful. And you have to keep your doses low, moderate, don't go into the high doses. And if you have some severe mental illnesses, then perhaps stay away from psychedelics altogether. If you do have a mental illness, I recommend you research very deeply your mental illness and then reports from people with that mental illness who have been taking psychedelics, and just to see what those reports are like, how those people have been handling it, and you can learn from their experiences whether it's helped them or it's actually hurt them. So you can find all those reports online. So let's say you have bipolar disorder, you can go into Google and type in something like reddit.com, bipolar disorder, and then whatever psychedelic you're going to plan to take, like LSD. You type that phrase into Google, and then you will get reports of people with bipolar disorder who have been doing LSD. You can see their dosages. You can see what kind of effects they've been experiencing, whether it was positive or negative, and you can use that to kind of get an idea of maybe what to expect. But even then, there's no guarantees. And the more severe your mental illness is, potentially the more things can go wrong. So just be careful. But also, if you're stuck in a profound mental illness and there's no cure and you've tried everything else and nothing has helped you, do consider the possibility that psychedelics can help with mental illness. Now, it depends on what kind of illness you have, what kind of psychedelic you use, how you use it, and so forth. But you can also do research into various academic studies and programs and clinical treatments that exist around the world that actually do help with depression, PTSD, anxiety by using various kinds of psychedelics. So that's not a myth. There's some really good science behind that. And actually, very soon, we're going to have the first FDA-approved use of psychedelics for treatment of depression, PTSD, and other things. That's coming in the next few years. And there's going to be legit treatments that are going to be available through various kinds of clinics and licensed doctors and therapists. So it's real science. It works. It's not just hippie mumbo jumbo. The next danger is that psychedelics can interfere with your pursuit of success, business, career, family, and relationships. So if you're really into self-help, the way that I was, especially 5 or 10 years ago, and you're in that spiral dynamic stage orange phase where you are working really hard on your business, on your dating life, on your family, whatever it is, and you've built up a good momentum there, be careful with psychedelics because they can derail that momentum. And in fact, that happened to me. And that was perhaps one of the biggest downsides that I personally experienced from psychedelics. It's kind of both a downside and an upside, is that, of course, psychedelics take you beyond the material domain, beyond material existence. So they're going to make all the material stuff you do on a daily level seem very petty and trivial and meaningless. This is sort of the point. That's what transcendence is about. You're transcending the material domain. But for a lot of people, they're so immature and underdeveloped that for them, transcending the material domain, they're not ready for that yet. Maybe 10 years from now, they'll be ready for that, but not yet. And that can be a problem. Because like if you're in the middle of building your business and then you start doing mushrooms, you might start to rethink whether you should be doing business at all or going to work at all, or whether you should be having a family at all. And that might be a problem. Now, that might also be a good thing. Maybe the business you're working on, maybe the job and the career you have is a bad career and it's making you miserable and depressed, in which case you got to think about leaving it or changing it somehow. But also maybe not. Maybe actually your business is the right business. Maybe your family actually isn't a bad family. Maybe you got to keep working on it. Maybe your family is one of the most important aspects of your life, and it's going to be a beautiful thing if you keep working on it. But if you just quit because you're second guessing yourself, you're going to regret that later. That could be a big mistake. For me personally, what I noticed is that when I started doing psychedelics, they made me a lot less productive. I was always very, very productive in my life, and I still am to some degree, but since I started doing psychedelics, I've become much less productive. And that is because simply the productivity has lost its meaning. You realize you're in a rat race. You realize that no matter how much you work, you're never going to be satisfied with your work. Whether you're an artist or a business person, no matter how much money you earn, it's never going to be enough. It's never going to make you happy. You're never going to reach a point in your business where you're fully satisfied with your business. And so this undermines your motivation for your business. And this can be a problem, especially, for example, if you face financial difficulties. Maybe you need to work on your business just so that you can pay your bills. And now is not the time for you to be questioning that. On the other hand, maybe if you reached a point in your business the way that I had when I started doing psychedelics, where my business was fairly stable, I was comfortable with my financial situation, and I could afford to take sort of a back seat and coast a little bit, maybe take a few years off or work half-time. I can afford to do that nowadays where I couldn't in the past. And so in that sense, I can sort of shift my priority from productivity mode more into spirituality mode, more into contemplation mode, more into sort of consciousness work mode, into the metaphysics of life. But understand there's going to be a cost to that. And I would estimate that I have lost probably at least hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars from my decision to do psychedelics, simply in productivity losses, simply because I've been less motivated to be materially productive. Now, you could say, well, but in the long term, that's actually good for you spiritually. Yeah, maybe, but still, you do have to consider the material dimension. It is nice to have hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars, and not to be losing that simply from going off into psychedelic territory. So just do keep that in mind. And I don't know, for example, I don't have a family, like my own family with children and wife and stuff that I'm really responsible for. So in that sense, I didn't encounter any problems there, but I'm sure I would have if I had some serious committed relationships and marriage and children and so forth, and a deep family life. I don't know, that those psychedelics would have certainly gotten me to start questioning that stuff, and I don't know what would have happened there. So be careful if you're someone who has a serious family life and values that. And the next danger of psychedelics is that you can potentially use them to escape tackling the problem of survival and building a good life. Honestly, for most people who watch my videos, their problem is not a lack of enlightenment, although, of course, none of them are enlightened, but their problem is more basic than that. Their problem is simply mastering survival, just being able to survive in a competent way, in an excellent way. For most people, that's their problem in life. And so if you're struggling to build a career, if you're struggling to get laid, if you're lonely, if you're struggling to manage your emotions, your anger, your depression, your anxiety, if you're dealing with these just very basic problems, and then you jump deep into psychedelic territory, what might happen is that the psychedelics might kind of convince you that, oh, well, I don't need to worry about any of that material stuff. Oh, who cares about having a job? Who cares about cleaning the house? Who cares about feeding the children? Who cares about taking out the trash? Who cares about building a good life? All that's bullshit. All that's just illusions and dreams. And instead, I'm gonna go into the mystical realms because that's where the good stuff's at, right? That can be a trap, a very big trap. Because I guarantee you, no matter how high you go into the mystical realms, no matter how deep of a God realization you reach, or what kind of DMT alien entities you speak to, and what kind of wisdom they download to you, or whatever, you're going to come back down into mundane material reality where you're going to have bills to pay, children to feed, house to clean, a physical body to take care of, and all the chores and other obligations that come with surviving in material life. And that is not something you want to do poorly. That is something you want to face head on, and you want to start to master that stuff. And a lot of the things I've talked about in the past in my older videos are about that. My Life Purpose course is all about that. So the danger is that you might start to take psychedelics, and then you might say, oh, well, yeah, I bought Leo's Life Purpose course, but now I started doing psychedelics. I don't even want a life purpose. It's all bullshit and illusions. And that would be a mistake. Because you're still going to have to develop some degree of success in physical material reality. Or if you don't, you're going to live in a miserable way on the material domain. Is that something that you really want? And how is that going to affect your spiritual pursuits? Probably not very well. Because when you're missing the foundation, the material foundation of your life, when that has a bunch of problems in it, I guarantee you it's going to impact your spiritual pursuits as well. Almost guaranteed. So you do want to keep one eye on the mystical domain, on the psychedelic domain, but you do want to keep one eye on the how do I build a good life, just at a very basic, practical level. How do I have a decent job? How do I get my bills paid and so forth so that I'm financially secure and comfortable? I'm not scrambling, running around. I'm not homeless and other things like this. Another potential danger is becoming too isolated. It's possible you start doing these psychedelics and you go deeper and deeper into yourself. You withdraw into yourself and into your own mind and psyche. And especially if you keep doing them chronically and you do a lot of them, this will happen more and more and more. You stop talking to your friends, you stop talking to your family, you become very isolated and alone, and then you can kind of trap yourself in this solipsistic echo chamber. And then that can spiral out of control. And then nobody is there to help you or to reinforce you or to kind of keep you within certain parameters. And then you can become antisocial and misanthropic. You can start to hate the world, especially once you start to misinterpret some of these psychedelic visions that you're having. So make sure that if you're doing psychedelics, you also balance it out with having some kind of social life where you're not becoming a total recluse. Another potential danger is making rash decisions. After a profound breakthrough trip, you might come back the next day and you might decide to divorce your wife, leave your children, quit your job, tell your boss to go fuck himself, walk away from your business partners and your business, go travel the world, sell your house, give away all your money to charity. And this can really end up biting you in the ass. Because usually, even though a psychedelic trip only lasts at most 12 hours, the next day, 24 hours later, you're going to be completely down from the trip. The chemical will not be in your system anymore. However, the lingering after effects on your psyche will still remain, and they usually remain for at least a few days, if not for the next week, especially after a deep trip. And so for the rest of that week, you can be having sort of thoughts that are not typically the kind of thoughts you would be having, which can cause you to make these sorts of rash decisions. So the best safety measure against this is to simply have a rule for yourself that after you trip, you're not going to make any rash or bold decisions for the next week. Just to make sure that your mind comes back down all the way and you're sober, you're totally stabilized, and then you can make your decisions. But don't make any important decisions. Like, don't be deciding to divorce your wife or leave your kids or tell your boss to go fuck himself 3 days after a profound trip. You're probably not thinking straight. Another danger of psychedelics is that they can demotivate your meditation practice. And this has happened to me. Actually, before I started to do meditation, before I started to do psychedelics, I meditated very regularly for about 5 years every single day without missing a single day. Once I started doing psychedelics, I started missing days of meditation, and I stopped meditating consistently and even for long periods of time. Because what happens is that the psychedelics take you into a realm of consciousness so high that it becomes clear to you that you will never reach these levels of consciousness through any kind of meditation practice. Maybe if you're a professional monk and you do it full time, it's your full-time job, you do it all day long for months, maybe you can reach those stages or those states of consciousness, but certainly not with a 1 hour a day practice. And even those monks, I guarantee you those monks have not reached levels of consciousness that I have reached through psychedelics at my highest points. So this can be demotivating as far as meditation or yoga practice, because you might think like, well, what's the point of meditating then? Especially because it's like, here I have been for 5 years meditating my ass off every 1 hour every day, and I still haven't been able to reach the level of consciousness I can reach in 15 minutes by taking some mushrooms or LSD. Like, what's the point? And that is true. Meditation is simply not that effective compared to psychedelics. So if you compare them like that, then meditation is not going to seem so appealing. So in a sense, it's actually easier to fool yourself to meditate when you don't know that psychedelics are possible. And this is actually, I think, one of the secret reasons why a lot of Buddhist practitioners and yoga practitioners and teachers and so forth, they stay away, they instinctively stay away from psychedelics, and they have sort of a stigma about psychedelics. And one of the reasons why is because psychedelics will very quickly reveal just how pitiful traditional meditation and yoga practices are. Unless you do them for decades. You got to really do them for decades for them to build up that strength to the point where maybe they can start to compete with psychedelics. But you certainly can't do it within a few years of practice. And so this can be a problem because it creates sort of this idea that, well, meditation is useless, yoga is useless, but then if all that is useless, then what's the work you're going to actually do to raise your baseline level of consciousness? Because psychedelics are not going to raise your baseline level of consciousness that much. You're going to come back down at the end of the day. And so that kind of leaves you nowhere. And so what I recommend is that if you do psychedelics, you still maintain your meditation practice or self-inquiry practice or yoga practice. You need some sort of manual daily practice that you maintain that will be raising your baseline state over a period of years and decades. And then on top of that, you're doing these spikes and hits with psychedelics that take you to these crazy peaks. But just be aware that it can demotivate that practice in you. And so you're going to have to compensate for that somehow in your mind. Another danger is falling into chronic usage. So my personal advice is not to use psychedelics more than once every 2 weeks. Have I broken that rule myself in the past? Yes, I have. I've done a period of 30 days straight of 5-MeO-DMT, high doses. That was a very crazy experience. I have a whole episode about that. You can go find it where I talk about that. But that was done in a very deliberate, almost scientific experiment-like way, just to see what actually happens. See, I like to experiment with my consciousness. I do all sorts of weird experiments like that. But for normal people, I don't recommend something like that, because if you start to use these psychedelics chronically, what's going to happen is that they will erode your mind and your sense of reality, and your life will turn upside down, and you will stop being able to think straight. And in fact, that did happen to me during my 30-day trial of experiment of 5-MeO-DMT. By the end of those 30 days, I didn't even make it to 30 days. I only did about 28 days. The last 2 days, I didn't even need to take any more because I was constantly high. I had so much 5-MeO-DMT in my system that for the last 2 days, it was like I was on 5-MeO-DMT 24/7 without taking any. And it was getting to the point where like it was really, really interfering with my mind and my sense of reality in my life. And so if I continued any further, it would have started to become disastrous. So I stopped. And that was a good experiment for me to try because now I can teach from that wisdom that I gained. But I would advise you not to do that. In fact, I recommend that you take long periods between trips to integrate. Even doing psychedelics twice a month, really, it's too much. If you do that consistently, you're not going to be able to integrate everything that they're revealing to you. So be careful about that. And if you start using it chronically, what's going to happen is it's going to become a crutch and a sort of addiction. And you're going to use it as an escape from actually doing the real manual labor that you need to do to develop yourself and grow yourself. Another trap that can happen and danger is the danger of misinterpreting various kinds of mystical visions that you can have on psychedelics. So you're going to have all sorts of different visions and insights will be revealed to you. But the thing is that you still have an ego. Maybe not at the peak, but when you come back down, the ego is still going to be there. And the ego is going to try to make sense of all these crazy experiences you've had. And I guarantee you it's going to corrupt them, and it's going to try to co-opt them and to use them towards its own selfish purposes. And here is where you run into the problem of Zen devilry, false notions of enlightenment, a messiah complex. You get a giant big head about all this. You start to proclaim yourself to be God, and you start to tell everybody that you're God and how great you are and how powerful you are. And now you think you have abilities to heal people and to change the world, to awaken everybody. And this can get very dangerous. You might get the idea to build a cult. You might get the idea that now you're qualified to teach people. And then, of course, what you're going to be teaching them is some corrupt version of this, of the truth. And so just be very careful, because your mind is very self-deceptive, and it's especially self-deceptive when you come down from a high mystical experience. And then these visions you can have all sorts of mystical visions, but they don't necessarily mean what you think they mean at face value. Your mind can easily imagine and hallucinate all sorts of stuff. Maybe you do some mushrooms, a heroic dose of mushrooms, and then you experience Jesus coming to you because you're from a Christian tradition. So to you, it's Jesus. Jesus comes to you, and Jesus delivers a personal message to you that now you are the messenger of Jesus here on earth. And then you actually believe that. And then you come back down from the trip, and now you actually believe that you are the disciple of Christ who has been ordained to convert all the heathens to Christianity or something like that. You see, the psychedelics, they will exacerbate any kind of biases and self-deceptions that you have going in your mind. So it's very important that for you to gain the most out of psychedelics, that you actually have a pure mind, a mind that has inquired into itself outside of the psychedelic trip and has cleared and purged out various kinds of biases and egotisms and shadow sides and selfishness. Because if you don't, if you have this dirty, corrupt mind, you have your mystical vision, it's going to come back, you're going to come back down, and then you're going to reinterpret it, and then you're going to corrupt it with all the corruptions in your own mind. It's going to all get corrupted, all mixed together. You won't be able to tell the truth from the bullshit, from the mystical vision, from the selfish personal needs you have, and the egotisms and shadow sides that you have. It's all going to mix together, and then it's going to turn into this toxic, mystical stew, and then you're going to go run around trying to infect everybody else with it. And this is what I would call Zen devilry. It's also possible that you have some sort of mystical vision or awakening even. And then you come back down and now you think you fully understand reality. When you don't, you only saw one facet, a small facet of the truth, not the whole truth. There's many facets. I have an episode called The Many Facets of Awakening. Go check that out. There's at least a dozen or more facets to awakening. And it usually takes you multiple trips over a period of months and years to assemble all the facets and to see the big picture. 1 or 2 trips is not going to be enough. So it's easy to misinterpret some of these visions or insights, or to think that you got it all figured out when actually you don't. And so you do have to be very careful about that. Just be aware that you can certainly deceive yourself about awakening and mystical visions, and you can misinterpret those, and you can misinterpret them very badly. So be aware of that. The next danger is actually the pain of being disconnected from God, as I call it. So what will happen if you're doing psychedelics properly is that you will eventually reach a stage of God consciousness, where you become conscious of God. And these are going to be some of the most beautiful and profound experiences you've ever had in your life. It will be the most important thing that's ever happened to you. And it's going to be the most beautiful thing. And then you're going to fall out of it. You're going to lose it the next day. And then you're going to wonder, well, how do I get it back? And then God itself will become like the thing that you chase. You will become intoxicated with God, with the idea of becoming God or being one with God, or the feeling of God's love, and all this is so intoxicating. This infinite love is so intoxicating that it's going to pain you just going through your everyday life, being disconnected from this love and from God. This could potentially get so bad, you might even get suicidal, because you might say to yourself, well, what's the point of living here in this material existence? Why do I have to go to my crappy job, to my crappy family, to my crappy wife, with my crappy children and my crappy friends, when I should be up there in heaven with God? And then you might start having suicidal thoughts. Or you just might be dreaming about the next time you can do psychedelics. It's like, well, okay, I can't wait to come back home from my work and to do more psychedelics. And you do that every day. And then it becomes an addiction for you, where you're using it as an escape from material existence and obligations and survival. And it can just actually lower the quality of your life. So counterintuitively, what's happened when I started using psychedelics is that I had the most profound mystical experiences. Some of the peaks of my life, the best experiences of my life, were on psychedelics. But then when I was just going through my ordinary life, I noticed that I was actually less happy than I used to be before psychedelics. Because before psychedelics, my ordinary life, that's all I knew, and I was kind of living in this blissful ignorance. Once you actually realize infinite love and heaven and God, but then you can't inhabit that 24/7, your ordinary life then seems very pale by comparison. And so it's challenging to cope with that. You have to sort of relearn to appreciate just the paleness of mundane existence, because it's so pathetic compared to the peaks you can achieve on psychedelics. So be careful with that. It can lead to some kind of addiction. If not a physical addiction, because you can't really get physically addicted on psychedelics, it can become a psychological addiction. Especially if your ordinary life kind of sucks and you got nothing going for you in ordinary life, then I can definitely see how these psychedelic peaks, they can become like an escape. And it becomes your sole purpose for living is just to escape into these psychedelic peaks. And that is not going to be healthy or sustainable in the long term, so be careful with that. Speaking of suicide, that's the next danger. Psychedelics can make some people suicidal for various reasons. Maybe because you feel like you're losing your mind. Maybe because you feel like life is meaningless and you've fallen into some sort of nihilistic, solipsistic funk. Maybe because you've misinterpreted one of these visions or insights or had an incomplete awakening. Maybe because you've had some sort of derealization and you're stuck in that. Or maybe because you want to merge and become one with God. And you don't want to do that work at the material level, so you want to quickly solve that through some sort of physical suicide. So of course, this would be very foolish. I recommend that you don't do this. I recommend that you don't harm your body at all. I recommend that you don't even consider suicide as a possibility for yourself. And of course, if you're taking psychedelics and then you're noticing yourself having suicidal thoughts, then the first thing you should do is you should completely discontinue psychedelics for at least 3 to 6 months. Don't do them at all. Reground yourself in ordinary life. But of course, psychedelics can have the opposite effect too. For many suicidal people, psychedelics can actually be the cure. Because psychedelics can show you something beyond the material domain in which maybe your suicide is grounded in. Because if you're dissatisfied with the material domain, which a lot of suicidal people are, then what you're really looking for is you're looking for the spiritual domain. But you don't know how to access it because you can't meditate, you can't do yoga, you can't self-inquire, you don't have those skills built up. So psychedelics can show you that higher domain. They can show you love. They can help you to deal with trauma. A lot of suicide is rooted in trauma. They can help lift your depression. They can show you the miracle of life, the miracle of love, of consciousness, of God. And so in this sense, they can prevent suicide, but they can also cause suicide. It depends, right? It really depends on how you use it. The next danger is the legal side of things. So you have to be very careful with how you're using these substances because these substances are illegal in many parts of the world. But not all parts. It depends, and it also depends which substances. So you should familiarize yourself with the legal nuances of these substances. You should know what the legal ramifications are for getting caught with them. You should know which substances are legal and which are not legal in your area. And this all requires research, depends on where you live. You should think carefully about how you're handling these substances, how you're driving around with them, how you're carrying them around, what the policing situation is like. And you should take precautions around all that to make sure that you're as safe as possible. And you also want to be very careful about supplying psychedelics to your friends. Because you see, it's one thing to get caught with some weed or some mushrooms in your pocket. That's one thing. It's another thing to be caught in the act of supplying somebody else with psychedelics. So there might be this tendency as you start to use psychedelics, you start to like them so much. Of course, then you want to share it with all your friends and your family. And then you start sending them psychedelics and you start inviting them over for psychedelics and this and that. And then eventually what happens is that people start talking and you get caught. And when they catch you in that situation, they're not going to just try you for owning a little bit of psychedelics. They're going to try you as a dealer. And even if you try to deny it and say, oh, well, but I wasn't dealing. I was just like me and my friends were just like smoking a joint or just doing some mushrooms together. Me and my girlfriend or something. Like, no, they're going to try you as a dealer. And you do not want to be tried as a drug dealer. So make sure you take precautions such that there can be no linkage between what you're doing and dealing. It's very, very important. And make sure that you take responsibility for the legal consequences. Like, do you understand what would happen if you get caught? Do you understand what the sentence terms are? Do you understand how many years in jail you could spend? Research that. That will sober your mind to the realities of things. Because if you don't research that, you might say, oh, well, if I get caught, I'll just get a few months in jail. When the reality is you might get 10 years in jail. And you didn't even know that. You didn't even consider that. So consider that. But to consider that, you have to do your research. I don't know what country you live in and what substances you take. It all depends. And then, by the way, if you only want to do legal substances, you can do that too. You can find countries and cities and other locations and certain substances which are legal in those areas. And you can do this whole thing legally, strictly legally, if you want to. And then there's all sorts of different quasi-legal gray areas too that you can explore. So it all depends on your risk tolerance. I'm not your lawyer, and I'm not telling you what you should or shouldn't do. I'm just saying study this stuff so you know what you're getting into, and then avoid the most serious dangers. Another danger with psychedelics is simply taking the wrong substance. Make sure you know what substance you're taking. Don't take unknown substances. Sometimes I read people just like, oh yeah, I took something, I don't know what it was. This is crazy. To me, this is crazy. You have to know what your substance is. You have to know the source of where you got it from, where it came from. You have to know the dosage. You have to be reasonably confident about the dosage being accurate. Don't be taking substances from people you don't know in random pill form. You don't know what's in that pill. You should know where your substance is coming from, and it should be coming from a quasi-reliable source at the very least, if not a reliable one. The next danger is toxicity from impure substances. Again, this very much depends on the source. If you're getting your substance from a trusted source, then this shouldn't be a problem. But if you're getting it from random people in random places, and you don't know what you're getting, and you don't know whether you can trust this person, you have no idea the impurities in the substance. And certain substances can contain fairly high impurities, especially things like MDMA or LSD, especially if you get it at a place like a rave or at a music festival. Those can be notoriously impure. So be careful about that. The next danger is there are certain kinds of psychedelics that can actually be physically damaging to your body. These might include ketamine, MDMA, N-bombs, DXM, nitrous oxide, and certain others. Of course, it depends how much you take them, how frequently you take them, but all of these substances, many of them that I listed here aren't really even considered classic psychedelics. So what I would recommend for you is stick to the classic psychedelics that will not physically damage your body, like DMT, mescaline, mushrooms, LSD. These will not physically damage your body and your brain in most cases for normal people. But something like MDMA actually permanently rewires your brain if you take it too much. It can lead to various kinds of neurological damage. Ketamine can lead to damage of, I believe, the bladder or the kidneys if you take it too much. And so can some of the other ones that I listed. So be careful with those. Try to stick to the classic psychedelics because they're the safest. They're the most field tested and proven. Then there are some substances that you shouldn't take at all, really, because they're dangerous, like salvia and datura. Personally, I've taken salvia, but I don't recommend you try it. It screws with your motor control. It creates very, very chaotic trips. And datura is even worse. So I warned you, stay away from those. I'm not saying don't take them so that you take them. I'm actually saying don't take them so you don't take them. Another danger is potential bad interactions between psychedelics and medications, especially the class of medications known as SSRIs, which are frequent amongst depressed users, people who are depressed. So if you're on SSRIs, don't combine that with psychedelics. And if you're on other kinds of medications, antipsychotic medications or whatever, you have to seriously research whether there's going to be a conflict with the medication and the substance that you're taking. Potentially these conflicts and interactions can be lethal. So be careful. Another related danger to that is mixing substances. When you mix two or more chemical substances together, they can have a synergistic effect, both positive or negative, and they can lead in directions that you couldn't anticipate. So there have been reported deaths, for example, from people taking 5-MeO-DMT plus some sort of medication they were on. Or if you combine 5-MeO-DMT with a Maui, like you do for ayahuasca, that could potentially turn into a lethal combination. And so when you're getting into these combinatorics of various medications and supplements and psychedelics, and you're taking multiple psychedelics together, this is where you're getting into dangerous territory. So watch out. I would recommend that you don't do that. Just stick to one chemical at a time so you clearly know what effect what is having on your mind. Because when you mix stuff together, you won't know what's causing what, the more variables you mix in there. Of course, another danger of psychedelics is that, as cliche as this is to say, but they can be a gateway drug into recreational hard drugs like cocaine, heroin, meth, crack, and so forth. It doesn't have to be that way, but it can be that way. Because what's going to happen is that the psychedelics will open your mind a lot. And you will explore this realm of psychedelics and you will try different kinds. And then you'll say to yourself, well, all these psychedelics, they're not bad. They're not hurting my body. How bad can it be? So what if let me go try some coke, let me go try some heroin. And then your heroin turns out to be laced with fentanyl and you kill yourself. Or you try some meth and the meth actually turns out to be ridiculously addictive, unlike any psychedelics you've ever tried. And so that line can get blurred. So be careful, especially because the sources that you're getting your psychedelics from can also be the same sources that might be offering you some of these recreational drugs. So you have to draw a real hard line between the recreational stuff and the psychedelics, and only stick to the psychedelics. The next possible danger is chronic weed addiction. So a lot of people like to combine psychedelics with weed. And personally, I've never done that, but I hear it's a good combo. It calms some people down, takes the edge off some of the trips. Okay, let's say that's fine. Sometimes, though, weed can actually make your trips more paranoid, and it can actually synergize in a negative way and cause bad trips, so keep that in mind. It's going to depend on you, depend on the kind of strain of weed you use, whatever. But also, the other problem is that then weed can become a chronic addiction. Unlike psychedelics, weed is used more chronically, and it tends to be addictive. So even if you're using your psychedelics only once a month, but then you get into a habit of using weed all the time, that's not going to be good for your development. So I recommend you avoid the weed entirely. Another potential danger is tripping in recreational areas like parties, raves, nightclubs, bars, tripping outdoors, tripping in the woods, where there are wild animals and other things you can crack your skull on. So I recommend you don't do psychedelics at these large crowded events like music festivals, parties, raves. This is, if you do that often, you're going to run into problems. I guarantee it. Best place to do psychedelics is just in a comfortable room with nobody around, nobody to interfere with you. The other danger is research chemicals. So you might start to get into the psychedelics. You might try some LSD, some mushrooms, then you decide to do some 4-ACO-DMT, which is basically a synthetic form of mushrooms, and other, synthetic forms of LSD, and so forth. And then you get into the research chemical field, which I've explored quite a bit. But the danger there is that with research chemicals, there's dozens of different kinds. There's always new ones being released. And then you might want to experiment with the new ones. But the more new they are, the less people have validated them, the less they've been field tested, the more danger there is, potentially, that you're going to stumble upon something harmful. And so you got to be careful with the research chemicals. It's also possible that you might order some research chemicals, and what they send you is they send you the wrong batch, and then that can potentially be quite problematic. The next danger is something called Hppd, which is hallucinogen persistent perception disorder. And what this is basically you do so much psychedelics at such high doses that the lingering psychedelic effects that it's had on your visual field and your auditory field something actually gets rewired in your brain such that those lingering effects remain even long after the trip. And they can last for months or years or a lifetime. The most common symptoms here might be tinnitus, which is ringing in the ears. It's a very common one amongst folks. So you can get sort of a persistent chronic ringing in the ears. Or you can get tracers, or you can get other kinds of visual distortions like visual noise in your visual field. And this can, like I said, this can last your entire lifetime. This happens in a very small percentage of people, but it does happen. And I don't know if we're sure exactly what causes it. Is it because they did too high of a dose? Is it because of their genetics? Something else? Maybe they mixed it with medications. We don't really know. But if you're concerned about that, research it. It's called Hppd. You can find plenty of case studies of it online, on the forums, on Reddit, and so forth. Personally, I've never had it. But then again, I'm very careful about my dosing. And I don't use chronically. I don't overuse. So I think there might be a genetic component, honestly, as well. Because most people just don't get it. And then some people do. So just be aware of that risk. There might be a 1% chance risk that you'll develop Hppd, especially if you do a lot or high doses. And for some people, they report that that's quite distressing, and it interferes with their ability to enjoy normal life. So just be aware of that. The next danger is with extracting, synthesizing, and dealing. I've already mentioned a little bit about dealing, but see, you might get into psychedelics, and then you might say to yourself, well, why am I buying them? I can just grow my own mushrooms. I can extract my own DMT. I can maybe even synthesize my own LSD or whatever. LSD is not easy to synthesize. But you might get some stupid idea like that. And again, once you start growing and extracting and synthesizing, you're basically at that point running a drug lab. And if they catch you, they're not going to charge you as a user. And they're not even going to charge you as a dealer. They're going to charge you as a drug lab. So again, be extremely careful about that. Don't do anything reckless or stupid like that. It's not worth it. You don't want to be charged with 20 years in prison for extracting some stupid couple of grams of DMT. And they will easily charge you that way if they catch you. So you've been warned. The next danger is just various kinds of online scams, shady dealers, and the possibility that you'll just get your money stolen. I've heard stories of people trying to buy stuff online from random websites and just not getting their product, getting their money stolen. They were total scams, fake websites, so be careful about that. And the last danger I'll mention here is driving intoxicated. Make sure that if you're on a psychedelic, you have a rule for yourself that you're not going to be driving, getting into a car. Sometimes I read these trip reports and it baffles me how stupid and irresponsible people are, where the guy, he's writing his trip report. He's like, yeah, I took some LSD and then, I took a quick shower. As it was coming on, I took a quick shower. I have 30 minutes, so I took a quick shower, and then I got out of the shower and I remembered, I forgot to buy some Coke at the drugstore. I don't mean cocaine. I mean just Coca-Cola. Some cocaine at the local drugstore. So let me go and get my daily Coca-Cola. And so he gets in the car and drives while he's taking the LSD already, and he's driving to get his Coca-Cola. And then, of course, the LSD comes on, and then, he can't even see straight while he's in his car. Like something stupid like this. Once you've taken the psychedelics, sit the fuck down, pay attention, contemplate. Don't be thinking about anything else. Focus on your trip. Don't be running anywhere. Don't be going anywhere. Don't be going for a walk. Don't be driving anywhere. And then sit through it until it's all virtually gone, and then you can use your car again. All right, that's it. Those are pretty much all the biggest dangers that I could think of. Maybe there's a few more that I'm forgetting, but that's mostly what you got to know. Now, here's the thing you also got to know, is that I was only focusing on the worst of the worst parts here. So again, this list might sound very bad, and you might say, Leo, oh my God, there's all these dangers and problems. I would never do psychedelics now, considering all this. But consider this, that the majority of these dangers can be very easily avoided if you're responsible, thoughtful, mindful, and careful. I've given you very quick solutions to many of these problems. Now, can you avoid all of them? No, you can't avoid all of them. And if you're a very, very, very risk-averse person, then psychedelics are simply not for you. But also don't forget that all of life is risk. And much of life has many bad potential outcomes. If I did a list like this of all the bad risks and problems and dangers of driving or sex or business or relationships, you would never want to drive, have sex, do business, or be in a relationship ever in your life. I mean, there are some serious dangers with driving. There are serious dangers with sex. There are serious dangers in business. You can get sued. Your business partners can scam you. Your products can kill people. And then you feel guilty and responsible for that morally and legally. With sex, you can catch an STD. You can get somebody pregnant. You might have to pay alimony for the rest of your life. Or the guy might impregnate you and then run off, and then you're stuck with the baby for the rest of your life. You think relationships are all safe? No, there's many dangers in relationships. Your partner can cheat on you, can infect you with an STD, can steal all your money and run away, can hurt you emotionally in many ways, can rape you, can abuse you, can hit you, can potentially brainwash you, can psychologically manipulate you, gaslight you, could even kill you. There's no insurance that your partner won't kill you in the middle of your sleep. It happens. Suicidal partners oftentimes end up harming their spouse or their girlfriend or their boyfriend or their children. It happens. So there's risks. Life is all about risk. It's about managing the risk, though. Right? It's about taking reasonable precautions. You don't want to be paranoid over this stuff, but you do also want to be careful. You don't want to pretend like you're invincible. You're not invincible. And I guess that's one of the other dangers of psychedelics, is that you start to do them and then you might start to feel like you're invincible, because you might start to say, well, but I'm God and God is immortal and invincible. Well, yeah, God is immortal and invincible, but not your human life. There are consequences in the relative material domain, so watch out. So let me now quickly run down a list of the top mistakes that psychedelic users make. These are the top ones. Number one is treating psychedelics like toys, not taking them seriously enough. Number two is simply just being immature about the whole process and being immature themselves, which is why I would recommend that if you're immature, don't do psychedelics at all. You're gonna screw it up. Maturity is one of the most important factors. Number three is just doing large doses and not measuring them accurately. This is such a huge mistake. Number four is frequent and chronic usage of psychedelics. Number five is tripping in dangerous areas with friends in social environments where there's a lot of noise and distraction. Number six is moving around too much, running around, not sitting still, not contemplating. I read trip reports of people who take some mushrooms and in the middle of the trip, they strip off all their clothes and then run down the street naked, screaming. This kind of stupidity will get you into trouble. This is what I mean by immaturity. If you can't control yourself, don't trip. Sometimes people tell me, well, Leo, but on a psychedelic trip, I'm supposed to be free. I just want to let myself go. Yeah, but you can't let yourself go so much that you jump off a balcony. You can't let yourself go so much that you strip off all your clothes and then you jump through your neighbor's window into their living room. If you can't control yourself from doing those things, if that's too much to ask of you, then don't trip. The next top mistake is mental illness. People with mental illness who are immature and mentally unstable, they get into psychedelics and then they spiral out of control and their mental illness just gets worse. And then they just keep doing it more. The next top mistake is Zen devilry. Go see my episode called Becoming a Zen Devil that explains how that works. And the next couple of mistakes are not enough theoretical foundation, which is all the stuff that I teach with Actualized.org. The metaphysics, the epistemics, the spiritual theory, the non-dual theory, the consciousness work. And then the next mistake is not doing the manual labor of personally developing yourself and of spiritual growth, assuming that the psychedelic will handle everything for you. You don't need to meditate. You don't need to contemplate anything. You don't need to read any books anymore. You don't got to do any practices anymore. You don't got to watch any videos anymore. You just fly by the seat of your pants and you just do psychedelics. This is going to be a disaster. And the final mistake, and this one's very counterintuitive. You know what the final one is? It's actually when you do a few trips and you tell yourself, okay, I got it. I got the message, now I'm hanging up the phone. I understand what psychedelics are. That is the final mistake. If you've only done 5 or 10 trips, or even 20 trips, you have no clue what psychedelics are. No clue. You're just a baby. It's like you're in first grade. You know nothing about the world yet from 20 trips. It requires about 100 trips just to start to get your bearings on what psychedelics are and how they work and their potential for spiritual growth. I see a lot of people fooling themselves, telling me, oh yeah, I've done psychedelics, I know what they're all about, and they've only done 5 trips. This is laughable. It's totally laughable. So don't fall into that mistake. But of course, you have to spread your trips out. I am not saying that you got to do a bunch of trips back to back. Treat this process as a long-term process. It's going to be a multi-year-long process of you exploring this territory through dozens and ultimately hundreds of trips. And precisely because you're spreading it out and there's going to be so much work here, you got to be very careful and methodical about it and follow the protocol. Because the more you do something that's dangerous, the more risk is incurred. So the more you're going to do it, the more careful you have to be. Make sense? All right, that's it. I'm done here. Now you are aware of all the dangers of psychedelics. Contemplate them, take them seriously, and decide for yourself whether this is something that you want to get involved with. I am not trying to convince you to do psychedelics. That's a decision you're going to make all by yourself. I just want to honestly outline their dangers. And I also want to talk about all their amazing potential benefits, which I've talked about in the past, and I'll talk more about in the future as well. And so now we're going to have a balanced perspective on these things. All right, so please remember to click that like button for me and come check out Actualized.org. That's my website. Here you will find my book list. You will find my life purpose course. You will find my blog. You will find my forum. You can support me at patreon.com/actualized. You can also find my second Actualized channel called Actualized Clips with shorter videos. And the last thing I want to say is that in the future, I actually want to emphasize more the importance of psychedelics in this work. Because what I see is I see a lot of people who follow my work who are lost and confused about these metaphysical and epistemic subjects that I talk about the most. And they just get lost in mental masturbation, theorizing about God endlessly, and about solipsism, and about this and about that, and it just leads absolutely nowhere. So it's very important that if you're following my work, that you actually do the work. Doing the work can be done through meditation, through yoga, through self-inquiry, through psychedelics, or other means. But honestly, and I'm just being honest here, from my direct experience, and I've experimented with all these different techniques, what I find is that psychedelics are the most direct, and they will give you the deepest and clearest understanding of what reality is. If that's what you want to understand, and it is very important, I feel, to understand that, even if you don't get a permanent enlightenment, forget about that. Just to understand what reality is, to know the truth, to know what God is, to know what love is, to know what truth is, to know what consciousness is, just to have these answers is enormously beneficial. Even if you don't get a permanent enlightenment, it's enormously beneficial to directly experience these things for yourself. And psychedelics are the only way many people will ever experience it. Because most people simply aren't devoted enough, committed enough to meditate for 10 years to get there, or to do intense 10-day retreats, or they're just not spiritually gifted enough to do it. A lot of people are spiritually gifted, but then they assume everybody else is too, but they're not. So how do we deliver these understandings to those who are not so spiritually gifted? So in the future, I will be emphasizing psychedelics more. I know that's controversial and people criticize me for that, But that's why I wanted to release this episode here, so that we are doing this in a responsible way. And again, when I say emphasize psychedelics more, I'm not pushing psychedelics on you. You don't have to do them. Everything I teach, everything that's true, God, love, consciousness, truth, and all the other stuff I do, all the epistemic stuff I do, all of that is true independent of psychedelics. It doesn't matter whether you do them or don't. It's still going to be true. You can still access all the same truths without psychedelics. But if there is a direct way, if there is a fast, easy way, why not use it? Because I know that many of you will simply never understand this stuff without it. I know personally, and the reason I know that is because, honestly, the level of understanding that I have now of reality would absolutely, for sure, I guarantee, would not be possible without my use of psychedelics. It would not be possible. Not at this depth. I could understand bits and pieces of it, but not at this level of depth. And if not for that, if not for the psychedelics and the clarity they gave me, then honestly, the things I would be teaching you now would be so shallow and distorted and corrupted that it would really be a disservice to all of you. And so that's the place that I'm coming from, is that I know that if that happened to me, I can only, it's scary to imagine the situation that many of you are in. And one of the saddest things is that there are these amazing tools that can help you to figure out and understand what you are, what reality is, what life is, how to live a good life, how to do spiritual work properly. There are these tools that can reveal this to you quickly, effortlessly, directly. And yet these tools are being misused, they're being demonized, they're being stigmatized, and they're not being taken full advantage of. And this situation simply cannot hold. As a society, we cannot afford to have these amazing tools so abused and underused. This is not going to hold. So the only way forward that I see is that we need to build a responsible path towards psychedelic use. And it cannot merely be a clinical path. It cannot just be that psychedelics in the future are used only to cure PTSD and depression. It must be that there is a path towards the highest metaphysical understanding, towards the highest spiritual realizations, to the highest stages of human development. There must be that path with psychedelics. And someone has to pioneer that path. There are others out there who are pioneering that path. I'm not the only one, but I feel it's my responsibility, since I have this information and knowledge and platform, is to help establish that path. Especially because a lot of people on this path, or in this field rather, I should say, do it rather irresponsibly. Or they do it in a sort of a limited way where, again, they're not using it to reach the highest metaphysical understanding. They're using it to justify their little, shamanic practice, or their, ayahuasca worldview, mother ayahuasca, something like that. But what I'm talking about is actually like a non-dual path through psychedelics. Now, that doesn't mean it excludes other practices. My version of this path includes those other practices, but it just adds this extra dimension of psychedelics on top of it. And to me, that's sort of the best of both worlds. And to me, that's how I see spirituality being done in the future. But someone has to invent that. And more than just invent it, because I'm not saying I'm the first person who's like done this. Not at all. Many people have come before me, and I'm, in a sense, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. You know, Terence McKenna and James Orrock. You know, he popularized 5-MeO-DMT. Martin Ball. There are many influential people in the psychedelic community. You know, Alexander Shulgin. So they all deserve their credit. But it's not just about inventing it or being the first. It's also about popularizing it. Because really what we're talking about here is changing culture, changing how society at large views these things. And it's also about using it to really, truly go towards direct non-duality, which wasn't the case, for example, with Terence McKenna. As amazing as some of the Terence McKenna literature is, and some of his quotes and some of his sayings, you know, he's sort of idolized in the psychedelic community. That's all great, but the bottom line is that he didn't really understand non-duality. He didn't really teach non-duality. He didn't connect the psychedelics with the non-duality. And a lot of people who do psychedelics or teach psychedelics, they don't really connect it to the highest, purest metaphysical understanding. They don't connect it with epistemology. They might not connect it with developmental psychology and other things like this. And so I feel like I'm in a position where I can do that, or at least play a role in that. And so that's the role that I'm playing. And it is very important to me to make sure that any of you who are going to be following that path, I'm going to expect you to be ridiculously responsible about how you're doing that. And if I see that any of you are doing this in an irresponsible manner with a bunch of Zen devilry and abuse and misuse and harm to self and to others and crazy antics and other things like this, I'm going to denounce you, and I'm going to refuse to have anything to do with you. I'm going to kick you off the forum. I'm going to boot you from my comment section, because I'm not going to tolerate that shit, because there's a larger game that we're playing here, and your Zen devilry is not going to fly. Right? So just be responsible, be conscious, and in the future, I'm excited to share some of my amazing discoveries in this field. I have not shared everything yet that I've discovered. There's a lot of amazing stuff here. So stay tuned for that.